am Dr. Janet Kamer, also known as Colonel Janet Kamer, and I am very pleased to introduce as our guest speaker tonight, Captain Michael Rakow. I'm going to let Mike tell a little bit about himself, but Mike has an interesting history. He has done, amongst other things, been an Army recruiter, and he has command of a recruiting unit at this point in time. And however, he is a health recruiter and decided that he himself wanted to get eventually out of the recruiting field and become a clinical psychologist. So he is right now a graduate student at Wheaton College, and he is my graduate student at Meyer Clinics, and he is in a neuropsychological testing practicum right now. He has worked with me at our Air Reserve Component Accesses to Community Services program on the comprehensive soldier fitness program for the Army. So I'm going to let him tell you all about that. So Mike,
Okay.
Here you go.
Thank you.
You've got the
I got my, yep. How's everybody doing this evening? Good. I'm glad to be here. I've done this presentation a couple times already, once in Georgia and then once at the previous iteration of this class. And basically, what I want to do is give you guys a little bit of an overview of comprehensive soldier fitness and sort of what that entails and how the Army's using it to help sort of turn the trend that we've started to see with regard to a lot of the psychological problems that are almost inevitable when you look at long-term rapid deployment cycles like we've had over the last decade or so. And it's been pretty effective so far, and we'll go into some of the reasons why and some of the things that we've done that have made it an evidence-based practice. But first I want to just give you an overview of who I am and where I come from, as far as the Army is concerned. Does anybody in here have prior military experience at all? What branch of the Army? 2 years? Okay, great, yeah. So you'll be familiar maybe with some of the terminology, and I'll try to make it, non-military as much as I can, so so it's not confusing as far as terminology. But I started out my career as an infantryman, and did that for probably the first, 9+ years of my Army time, and all the way from infantry private through being commissioned as an infantry officer. And so somehow during that time, partially because of the period of history we were in, and just by chance, I didn't end up being deployed overseas anywhere. I came in during the tail end of the first Gulf War, basically as all the major fighting was, basically wound down, but we still had a bunch of troops over there. And, at the time that I came in, I thought for sure they said, okay, you're going. You basically expect to be in Iraq. And it didn't happen. And we had a period of relative peace when you look at the big scale of things. You only had minor little conflicts and whatnot as compared to what we have today. And not too long after I was commissioned as an infantry officer, I got assigned to a medical brigade headquarters. And so I was the only infantry guy in headquarters, and everybody else was medical professionals. So I said, hey, my background is psychology. My grad was psychology. I think it's probably time to make the switch into my general field and go into the Medical Service Corps, where all the psychologists are, as well as all the healthcare administrators and other variety of different specialties. So I switched over, became a Medical Service Corps officer as a healthcare administrator to kind of start myself on that path. I had a privilege of working with basically every kind of medical professional you could imagine in the Army. And so what I sort of bring to the table today is a little peppering of different perspectives, from everything from dentists to physicians to healthcare administrators. I was mentored by an entomologist at one point, a botanist, you name it, different kinds of specialties. And so as a health administrator for several years, I've gotten to lead all of those different people from all different levels of rank, from privates on up to colonels. And sometimes it's been a challenging job, but other times, but it's also been a rewarding job, because I've had all those different perspectives that have kind of fed into where I am now. And so a few years ago, I got assigned to medical recruiting, and now I have the privilege of being able to see those people at the very beginning of their career and sort of bring them into the Army with all of their desires to train soldiers and take care of soldiers. And I get to sort of help mentor some of them at the very beginning of their career, pass on what I've learned from all those senior professionals I've worked with. So that sort of brings me full circle to where I am today, working on my doctorate in clinical psych, and still a healthcare administrator, but a healthcare administrator in a recruiting role. So if you guys have any questions about any of that stuff, any of those, areas. Or if you want to join the Army, I can definitely take care of that. There's an age limit by specialty, though. So, people who are physicians can be up to 60, or dentists. But, we're going to talk more so about the psychological side of things because that's what, you guys are here in the sort of behavioral health realm. And we're going to talk a little bit about the Comprehensive Soldier Fitness Program. One of the things that over the last several years that Americans have kind of, I guess, really since the world wars have been done in the last, quite a few decades, we've lived in a world where, other than 9/11, we really haven't had, attacks on U.S. soil or any trauma that's happened on a large scale in the United States. So we've kind of come to the place, 9/11 was a big wake-up call for us, and 10 years down the road from that, we already have some people who are starting to forget the significance of that event, unfortunately, especially young folks who don't really have as much of a clear recollection of it. And so we sort of go through our lives a lot of times taking for granted that we live in relative safety, and we don't have the kind of environment that some people who live overseas have where life support basically is not as easy to come by. I mean, sometimes you live in a refugee state, people live where the government is unstable, and we've been really fortunate that we don't have that here. So what happens when a person comes into the military having lived in a relatively secure lifestyle for their entire life? Well, they're going to be a little bit taken aback when they go to someplace in the world where that's not the case, and all of a sudden they realize that major trauma happens almost on a daily basis in some parts of the world. So what we've had to do is sort of prepare people for that as best we can, and that's basically at the core of it. That's what Comprehensive Soldier Fitness is about, is how do we help somebody from a really safe area of the world for being able to go into an area of the world where safety is no guarantee, and in fact, a lot of times people are trying to bring harm to them. You guys probably remember in 2010, Fort Hood had a pretty major event that happened right on a military installation where we would have thought that no such thing could happen because for the most part they're pretty secure, and we have people who are able to respond to something like that. But when it happens in the blink of an eye, it doesn't matter how good your system is to be able to respond to it. When it's one of your own, like it was in this case, you can't predict that. That's one of those things that we could go into the whole discussion about what could have been done before Major Hassan got to that point where he did what he did. But in the moment, you can't predict that. You don't know that that's going to happen. So it sort of brought to light that this can hit us at home, that traumatic events is even right on a military installation. And so Comprehensive Soldier Fitness is one of those ways that at least before, during, and after, we can be a little bit better prepared for it, not prevent the event from occurring. It won't in this case, in a case like this, but it's going to help you deal with that type of an event. So Comprehensive Soldier Fitness overall is it's a long-term assessment and development program. It's not a one-time thing. And in the military, we've sometimes had training where it's been almost flavor of the month training, where they say, okay, you got to do this, you got to learn this, train on that. It's a requirement. So people go through the motions, they do the training that they need to do, they learn it short term, and then they kind of wipe it from their mind because that requirement is done. That's not what Comprehensive Soldier Fitness is about. That's not how it works. It's an ongoing thing. So it's not a one-time training event. It's not a chain teaching where the higher-ups teach the next level and teach the next level, and then it's done. It's an ongoing. It's not a screen for particular physical or psychological disease or dysfunction, including suicide. So it's not designed to really screen those things. It's not a clinical assessment or anything of that sort. So that's really not the function of it, but in theory, as we'll talk about in a few minutes here, it can potentially help prevent some of those things from reaching a significance. So all of the training combined, hopefully, and we'll see some studies that have kind of shown that, can help prevent some of those things from occurring, even though it doesn't technically screen for them. And then it's not something we do after a negative event occurs, because then it's too late. You need to be able to go into that negative event, but be prepared for it, and that's what it's about. Okay, so does anybody know, in a nutshell, what the difference is between an adverse event and a traumatic event? Why do we make that distinction? What might be the difference? Really, it could be the same event, but it's a difference in how you look at that event and how you prepare and come out of it. So, both an adverse event and a traumatic event, it's something that shakes you up pretty badly. But as you can see, the difference here is if we're looking at resilience training, somebody comes in at a different baseline if they've had resilience training versus somebody who hasn't had resilience training when they go into an event. So someone who's had resilience training is more prone to think of it as an adverse event, where someone who hasn't had it is more prone to think of that as a traumatic. It shakes you to the core, like you said. And then coming out the other side, there's a lot of different potential ways that they could come out of it. They could come out of it and then have post-adversity growth, which basically means that they've taken that event, they've learned something from it. It's still really shaking them up. It's been adverse. Nobody would want to go through that event again, but they've learned from it, and if it does occur again, they're better prepared for it because they've had that growth and they've gotten back up to that baseline where they've built up a strong resilience. If they come out of it the other way and they've viewed this as a traumatic event and it's shaken that badly to the core, you'll have a certain number of people who will be able to get back up to what their baseline was, just on their own, somehow be able to do that. Then you'll have others who will kind of go on this downward spiral, this downward path where all of these things can occur. Sometimes they will have a little help that gets them back up to where they need to be, whether it's getting their own help and reaching out for that themselves, or sometimes having someone else sort of facilitate that for them. And then others who don't get either of these things, they don't pull out of it on their own, and they don't have somebody else to help them reach out for some other help, could continue to spiral downward to what actually becomes a clinically significant disorder, and that's when they're in a really bad place and they're actual treatment. They're going to need to see a psychiatrist, social worker, somebody like that who can take care of them and really get them some clinical help that they might need at that point. We hope that none of these things occur, but obviously very often when you get to that point, it's much more prone to have any of those really negative things happen. Just to point out at the top there, those are some of the adversity growth things that could be gained from the positive side of coming out of it, having already had some resilience going in. Okay, on this slide there's a lot on here, and it can be a little bit confusing in a way. Just to tell you what the different chapters are ways that you could be separated from the military. And so different chapters mean different things depending on what the nature of your discharge is. Chapter 10 is in lieu of a court-martial. They decide to separate the person instead of continuing through with the court-martial process and basically ended up possibly on a jail. Chapter 13 is unsatisfactory performance separation. And then chapter 14 is for misconduct. And I don't want to get too bogged down in all of these different lines and all of this detail over here. The red circle here is probably the biggest thing that you can take from this slide, which is the population that's most at risk for coming out of a traumatic situation in a more negative way as opposed to having that post-adversity growth. They're a little less resilient as a population, and that's the lowest ranking folks. They don't have as many resources to draw upon as, say, somebody who's a major or colonel or something. They're going to have a lot more resources at their disposal. They're usually a little more mature. Those people who are higher ranking, these folks are a little bit less mature, generally speaking. You can only be a certain age to come in as an E1 through E4. So if you're beyond that age and that maturity, then you wouldn't be in that set for the most part. So these folks are going to be a little bit less mature as far as age, a little bit fewer, significantly fewer resources in some cases. So they're most at risk. So something to keep in mind, when you're looking at an overall military population, those folks, you can see the numbers here. I mean, we don't have FY is the fiscal year. We don't have fiscal year 11 stats on here yet because this is a few months old, but you will see, look at the huge difference there from 1.36 to 3.12 just when you're going from an E5 to an E4, down one grade in rank. And then it's pretty small when you look up here at the O's are the officers, the W's are the warrant officers. And so it's a reverse, lowest ranking at the top and highest ranking at the bottom. So the 4 pillars of the comprehensive soldier fitness. There are several different parts to this. First one is the global assessment tool. It's an online survey. It says it takes about 13 minutes on there, but I think it took me just a little over 10, 11, 12, something like that last time I did it. So it's not one of those surveys where they say it's going to take 13 minutes and it actually takes you an hour. A lot of times they try to do that just to get people to take it. In this case, it actually is a really short, easy survey. So it's designed to be something that soldiers will use. They'll use it on their own to assess sort of where they're at. They have to take it at least annually. If they're deploying, then they might have to take it more frequently than that. But it's mandatory, like it says there, for soldiers. And then for family members, they can go on there and take it as well, but it's optional for them, or DA civilians as well. And it's not for the command. It's not for something like me as a commander to look at it and say, oh, this soldier over here has got some real problems. I better watch out and, keep a handle on that soldier. It's for that soldier individually to know that he or she may have an area that's, I want to say, area in which they need to build up their resilience. And then comprehensive resilience is a self-development tool where they can look at a particular area where they might need a little bit extra work and build on that on their own. And you can see there that the modules are designed for each particular area. And as they use these modules online, it sort of tracks the data and it can see whether it's been successful the next time they take the GAT, whether using certain modules was successful in improving that area of resilience for the individual. And over time, if you see that a particular module just doesn't do any good for anybody, then that one gets thrown out and they put something new in place that's more effective. So it is evidence-based. Institutional military resilience training. TRADOC is the training doctrine command. So all of the schools that new folks come into when they go through the Army, come into the Army, or when they advance throughout their career, those are TRADOC schools. So periodically throughout your career, like me as an officer, when I was enlisted, I went through basic training. That's that everybody comes in through. As an officer, I went to an officer's basic. When I first became an officer, I've gone to a captain's career course, as a mid-grade officer, and then you continue on through like F college and all the different more advanced training as you go, and they'll put a little bit of resilience in each of those. Most of it's going to be kind of up front when you first come in to make sure that you understand how to keep yourself, to keep your resilience up. And then it becomes more leader-oriented the further on you go in your career, which we'll talk about in a couple slides here. We also have master resilience trainers who will be assigned to different units. And I have one of those for my own company. A lot of companies don't have their own, but I'm fortunate enough that I do have my own company. And then they're trained. They go through a whole training program, which we'll talk about the different levels of that in a couple slides here. But they go through that training program so they can be sort of one of the soldiers, so they can relate to what those folks go through and understand at sort of a frontline level what the soldier's job entails, but yet they will also be trained in additional coping skills and resilience so that they can bring that to those folks. So emotional fitness. If you take a look at this, this is another slide that sort of shows us the proportionality to rank. And you notice that 5 is a better emotional fitness, whereas the lower numbers, 1 and below, are not as much of an emotional, or a lower ranking of emotional fitness. And so the 06s through 010s are the higher ranking, and then the E1 through the lower ranking. So you see that the mean emotional fitness is much higher for the higher ranking folks and much lower for the lower ranking folks. So that sort of corresponds to what we saw on the earlier slide, where the most at risk are the lower ranking individuals. And so the emotional fitness distribution, as far as the GAT assesses, corresponds with what we've seen with those who are at risk for different types of problems coming out of that situation. Okay, so we talked about, just briefly touched on the fact that there are different components of the Comprehensive Soldier Fitness Program, and these are the different main components that exist currently. You have your emotional, social, family, and spiritual. And last time we did this, we had somebody ask, what does spiritual mean? Because people have different types of faith backgrounds or no faith background in some cases. Well, spiritual is a broader thing. It's a attaching significance, I suppose, to your existence, whether it's that comes to you through your religious belief or through just having a purpose in what you're here for and what you're doing in your life, your family, those kinds of things that sort of draw on from this one into maybe a more spiritual, cosmic sense of your worth and value and the value of human existence. So it's not necessarily any particular religious belief. It's more broad than that. But it can be religion for those people who that's important to. Emotional is probably sort of self-explanatory. Social, your whole social network and all that entails. And it's interesting because you would think that these 4 categories are pretty broad, right? So you'd think maybe it wouldn't be sensitive enough to really tell us much information. But I had a situation, it was where we did one in Georgia. Was that August or so, something like that? I think it was around August. Yeah.
Because it gives you an idea of some of the problems.
Yeah, and we had a couple situations going on in my unit at the time. I had one soldier who had senior NCO, or senior non-commissioned officer, who you'd think would know better, got into a dispute with somebody else and decided to let it come to blows and that kind of thing. So I was dealing with military justice related to that person and how to, I guess, punish somebody for doing that. And let's take corrective action for what had happened there. And then had another individual who actually had ended up in jail because he had a rigid confrontation with his spouse where that became physical. And so I was both of those things at sort of the same time. And I had taken the GAT probably, I guess, less than a year prior. But I said, okay, well, since I'm going to be talking to some people in Atlanta about the comprehensive soldier fitness, I'll go ahead and take the GAT so I can have a current one that I can use to discuss it and just kind of see where everything is at. And it was sensitive enough that it picked up, especially with social, because your whole military organization kind of falls into your social. It was sensitive enough that you saw this one drop for me. In my case, I was relying on family and spiritual to sort of, get me through the issues I was dealing with those couple of soldiers and their families and everything. And so you saw these come up a little bit for me because those were where I was sort of drawing that strength from, an emotional state essentially the same. So it picked up on that. It wasn't a huge fluctuation, but it was enough that you could see that that every little thing that happens to you somehow comes into play with regard to your resilience level.
Talked about that quite a bit. To me, that says a lot about the validity of the test and the sensitivity of the test. Mm-hmm. That the stress that was going on in his particular unit when he took the GAT, it accurately reflected some of the changes in his own functioning. Yeah. And it was a pretty stressful time. It was,
but fortunately my overall resilience was pretty high going into it, so I came out of it just fine, and both of those soldiers are okay too, so that's good. Future, some of the plans that they've made to sort of, I guess, drill down to more specific levels. These are some of the things that we're looking at in the future that we might sort of break each category out into to make it a little bit more specific. And emotional fitness would incorporate all of these things, including everything from character strength to work engagement and whatnot. Social fitness, trust and friendship, and then family fitness is just its own category, and spiritual fitness its own broad category. So they didn't really break these down any more specifically yet, but the emotional and social were suggested that we may break those down a little bit.
Can you read that, or is that too small? Jose, yeah. Would you mind, Captain
just
Rackow,
going
through the whole thing?
Yeah, under emotional fitness, what's been suggested is that we may include positive emotions, negative emotions and depression, optimism, flexible thinking, work engagement, problem coping, and then character strengths such as wisdom, courage, humanity, justice, temperance, transcendence. And then under social fitness, they broke it down just into trust, friendship, and then the other two categories of family and spiritual, they didn't break any further in the suggested future plan. And this is not necessarily how it's going to look when it's all said and done if they do decide to break it down further, but this was just a suggested possible future breakdown of it. Okay, and it does give more specific feedback too when you take the GAT assessment. This is an example of a couple people who may have taken the GAT just as a sample. And I'm not going to read all of that to you, but you can just kind of look it over for yourself as far as some of the specifics that you might get from it if you were to take the GAT. And it's like, you ever do those online surveys where they just, ask you to answer a bunch of questions for yourself. It's kind of similar to that, except this is actually evidence-based. So it's not just saying nice things that you say, oh, yeah, that's me, that's me. No, this is saying things that helps you build upon the information. The first one says, based on your answers, you are a relatively cheerful and optimistic individual, strongly oriented to friends and family. These are notable assets. However, when compared to other soldiers, you are not strongly engaged in your work in the Army and seem to lack strong sense of meaning and purpose. You are not active in your coping style and, by your own report, not a very flexible thinker. These characteristics may limit your ability to handle stress and adversity effectively if and when encountered. And then the second one says, these results suggest that you will likely benefit from training that encourages flexible thinking and active problem solving. Here's a link for module, and they would have a link there. As well as training that helps you see the larger significance of your work in life, and then they would put another link there. And given your already strong relationships with friends and family, they would give you a link for that as well. And you might further benefit from advanced training in these areas, as this will enhance your fitness in other domains. So these really, I guess these aren't probably two different people. It's the same person, but different elements of that same person's report. The first one is giving an overall assessment. The second one, what can you do about this? Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, soldiers, DA civilians, people who take the GAT survey are directed to self-development activities that they can do. It's evidence-based, and then training offered online to all Army components and deployed soldiers and family members. And then what happened was military and civilian expert work groups determined the knowledge, skills, and attributes for each dimension. So basically, this is all about the self-development component of it and what you can do based on each on the results of the GAT. And so that's sort of how they came out with the different components that went into the self-development. So it focuses on knowledge attributes like knowledge, skills, and behaviors. Level 1 is understanding what makes a resilient person. So that's the general psychoeducation, if you will, of what makes somebody resilient. Level 2 is developing greater individual resilience. So once you understand what makes someone resilient, then you work on that within yourself, and you've done it as well. So it's not just you doing it on your own, but also you get trained. And then level 3 is leadership level, and that's how I mentioned as you go on through your career, it becomes more leadership oriented. So as you get into more advanced training, like if you're an officer or you're a senior NCO, you're going to have training that focuses on, okay, now that I know how to build resilience in myself, how do I help build that in my unit and the other folks that I'm responsible for leading and managing? So you have to establish a command climate or an organizational climate that supports resilience in individuals, and also knowing how to identify when somebody's having a really tough time and somebody maybe needs a little bit of extra help, or somebody has family issues going on, or whatever it might be, whether it's on the job or off the job. In the military, we're a little bit more responsible for people off the job than in a civilian organization. I've worked in both, so I know that in civilian companies that I've worked for, cared about each other. It doesn't mean we didn't care about each other, but for the most part, what you did in your own home life on your own didn't concern other folks that you worked with. Army, we do stick our noses, or in the military as a whole, we do stick our noses into people's home life and their business, and because it's all part of our military family as well. So we care about what happens in people's homes, and if they're going through a divorce or separation or something like that, that's pretty stressful for somebody. That's something we need to look out for, because that can affect them on the job. And when the kinds of jobs that we do sometimes, if somebody's under an extreme amount of stress already at home, and then they encounter that high level of stress on the job, it could be threatening. So it's a pretty serious thing.
According to the chart, you build up from level 1 to level 3, correct?
Right.
Right. So in level 3, by the time you reach level 3, you don't need to take as many surveys in order to gain a 5. Is that essentially how it's supposed to be read?
Surveys taken. Yeah, that's interesting. How surveys taken.
Because to
think
reach
it's,
a score of 5, you can potentially not take any surveys and receive a 5. And I'm just wondering, does that mean having gone through level 1, level 2, you've taken because if you look at level 2, you can potentially take 80 surveys and reach a 4. So then are you just building upon
I think,
to the point where you don't need these surveys and you can have a high score?
yeah, I don't think that's surveys taken per person. I think that's the overall pool of surveys that these numbers were drawn from. Because, for instance, like 80 surveys as an example. If that was one person that was taking 80 surveys, I've been in the Army for 19 years, and I've probably I don't know, one a year for the last however many years this has been going. So even if I were deploying, I might do an extra one or two during that year. So nobody would really reach that level. So I think this is probably not.
So trajectory-wise, though, what's it saying then?
Yeah, trajectory-wise, it's saying that, well, that you should be reaching on the bottom axis here is that you should be reaching by the time you're at leadership level or level 3, you should be reaching pretty close to a 5 in resilience.
Okay.
But I think this is just giving us data as to how many total people fall into that category of level 1 versus 2 and 3. So the majority of people would be in level 2. So that's the top of the bell curve. The majority of people are in here somewhere, whereas there are fewer people who've reached this leadership level. Doesn't mean they couldn't be at a level 5 as far as their resilience score,
Right.
but there are fewer people that are actually at that leadership level where they've mastered all of the previous 2 levels and the 3rd level as well. So it's looking at the total numbers of people that fall into each category, level 1, 2, and 3. And again, this is not actually like 60 people. It's some component of that, or either a percentage or a 60,000 or whatever it is, whatever the number represents, but it's a proportionate amount. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it
Okay.
does.
So we're developing critical thinking, knowledge, and skills to overcome challenges, to mature, and to bounce back from adversity. All training is evidence-based. I mentioned that earlier. And the curriculum is ongoing. There's always a continuous development of the curriculum to take out those pieces that the evidence doesn't support, and to put in new pieces that are supported by evidence. This seems maybe a little bit common sense, but it's not as much as you might think, because I think we've all probably been at some point in our life where we got caught in one of these things called thinking traps sometimes. Challenges are temporary, not permanent. Sometimes when you're in the midst of a really bad place in your life, you go, wow, how am I ever going to get out of this situation? I don't see anything getting better, and you think of it as a permanent scenario. And it's not. It's a temporary challenge. Local, not global. It seems like everything's falling apart. The whole world is disastrous. I don't have anybody to help me. My family doesn't care, whatever. People get into those thinking traps, and they think of it as an overall global situation. If you're deployed, you can, man, I'm never going to see my home again. So that could be thinking that it's permanent, you're never going to see home again, and then thinking that it's cool because all heck is breaking loose and everything is bad in your way of thinking about it. Challenges can be changed by your own effort. You're not a helpless victim. And sometimes that means calling upon other people to help you out of your situation. So it's not always just you, but knowing that you're not a helpless victim, that there are things you can do to either engage other resources or to reach out for help. Sometimes within yourself you can find the means to get out of that situation, but you just have to have that mindset that you're not a helpless victim. So we teach those things and help avoid some of those thinking traps that people might otherwise run into. Comprehensive Soldier Fitness Trainers, that's what CSF is, Comprehensive Soldier Fitness Trainers, or trains, I should say, trains the force by teaching resilience fundamentals, providing leader education and deployment cycle training, and teaching personal and professional skills that maximize individual performance. This is sort of a recap of what we've already talked about, progressive, evidence-based, and throughout your career. Okay, so the different levels of trainers that we have, and what the training incorporates. Core competencies such as optimism, mental agility, and self-regulation. Teach non-commissioned officers, for the most part, soldiers helping soldiers. And based on the University of Pennsylvania curriculum modified for a military population. I'm trying to remember what PRP, that acronym's escaping me right now, but the University of Pennsylvania study that they did modified for a military population. That was Seligman and
I can't remember what PRP stands for in this context either. One of the things that I think is important to stress is that these are not mental health providers that are the master resilience trainers. They're mostly non-commissioned officers that are doing this, that are embedded in their units. So I think it'd be important to address that.
that is a particularly good point for this class, because you have both who will take this class. Some who might be in the profession, and others who might be just interested in working with this population, learning more about it, and may or may not be licensed professionals. And so some of this type, some of these principles are going to function for you regardless of whether you're a licensed professional or if you're somebody who is not. Because non-commissioned officers in the Army use these every day, and they're effective. They work with soldiers. So same thing applies to veteran populations who've already been in the military and now out in the civilian world, trying to get by, still dealing with some of the stuff that they may have encountered when they were in the service. So I think a lot of the principles here are relevant to both military population and military folks who are in a civilian population, even just civilians who are encountering tough stuff in their daily life. So it's a proven system that's working for us. I know Seligman was one of the
originator of the program at the University of Pennsylvania.
and
it originally was a program for helping children, and it was developed with Brigadier General Coram from the Army. She wanted to have it adapted for the military, specifically for the Army. So it was originally a children's program that got adapted.
And it all kind of flows from the positive psychology and resilience whole field of research, and I think we're seeing a lot more of our field going in that direction. It's not to say the field is bought into it yet, but there's a pretty significant trend in that direction, and the military's taking advantage of it, which I've been really glad to see. I think it's made a great culture change for us over the last several years. So that's where the research comes from, at its core before it became a military program. We have master resilience trainers who attend a 10-day course sequence, and they are the primary supervisors of soldiers. So again, they're NCOs who are working with soldiers on a daily basis. Then you have master resilience trained facilitators. They attend an additional 5 days of training and facilitate course breakout group training. So it's just a little bit more facilitation experience and training that prepares them for introducing this to a broader audience. And then you have the trainer, the master resilience trainer, who receives an additional 5 days of training course, and they can do even sort of a broader, higher level training where they're going to prepare other folks to go out and train people in resilience. A little bit more about the master resilience trainer and who they are. They're supposed to live the skills that they've been taught. For the most part, I found that to be the case. Sometimes you got to remind them, hey, didn't you learn this? Remember that? Because you'll see somebody start to freak out about something. You might want to, remind them that you got to set the example to the NCO who might be freaking out about something, who's supposed to be a resilience trainer. But for the most part, I've seen them live in it, and they do a pretty good job of reminding people to get out of those traps that we mentioned and to remember what they learned about resilience. Uses the skills during formal and informal counseling. What I was just talking about is more of an informal, but also NCOs, one of their jobs is to counsel soldiers. And so on a periodic basis, they're going to counsel on their performance, on other factors that influence their job, mentor them to help them grow in their career. And one of the things they should be doing while they're doing that counseling is also talking about tools for resilience and how to improve in those areas. This is, we call this the URAC, and this is for the recruiting command. Again, it's been used elsewhere throughout the Army. It's not universal, but various different places in the Army where they've sort of looked at it and said, hey, we've got a pretty high risk for having some issues. They've used this, and you would think recruiting command is not that hard a job, right? We wouldn't have that many issues, but we have had a relatively high suicide rate in the recruiting command. And other psychological issues. I think largely that's because we're so far away from military installation and the culture that normally has, and the facilities that are on military installations. So we have fewer resources available to us in the recruiting command when something goes wrong, and a lot of times it does with people's, most often it's marriage and family problems that we'll see. It's a hard, long day in a recruiting world, believe it or not. And so some of these things come into play, and then when you have somebody who starts to go on a downward spiral, it's up to their command and their leaders to really recognize that and get them help in the civilian medical network, because they're not on post where they can easily access those things. And so we've developed this tool, the leaders, to sort of formally, sort of informally, when they're counseling their soldiers, to ask them some questions that are important to knowing how.
And before you flip through that, Captain Rakow, if you could just read it to the class, because it's pretty small.
Yep. On here, this is the progress check that we do. How many areas of concern have been identified? What are they? Countermeasures that are used. If you've decided that a countermeasure of some type was warranted, you'll talk a little bit on there, just really, really briefly, as far as what you might have recommended for that individual. And then a plan of action. The subordinate will sign it, and the supervisor will sign it. They'll put the date and the areas of concern and the areas of concern score that they determined when they were doing their counseling. And that gives a really brief snapshot of where that person's at, how they're doing, and things that might have been implemented or at least starting to be implemented to try to help that person out if they need it. So I'll show you where that all comes from on the next couple here. Oh, and just on the right-hand side, if you just want to notice that it is confidential, limited confidentiality. If there's a serious issue, then the command is supposed to take action on that. You know, if there's a really problem, the person does not have to answer this. If they want to, they don't have to answer any of the questions. But it's recommended as a positive tool for the leader and subordinate to engage in that discussion. And that's more of the same. It goes over the steps for the URAC on the left-hand side there. Supervisors will maintain one for each soldier. They complete it together in one sitting, preferably in a relaxed and informal setting. That's so you can encourage the individual to talk. If you make it too formal, people don't really want to say much, and they'll kind of clam up. So we try to make it as informal as possible, but it's still a little bit formal because it's a counseling session of sorts. On the left-hand side of this, the pages are going to look like they're a little bit out of order because of the fact that it folds into a booklet, and so I'll just go at them as we see them, but they're a little bit, the order might seem a little strange. On the left-hand side, those are some of the countermeasures that you may be able to access if you have concerns with a soldier, everything from family resources to spiritual, social support, professional life, physical health and sleep, medical, exercise, etc. Personal behaviors like legal, financial, motor vehicle safety, stress symptoms, substance abuse problems, and counseling and chaplain resources. So those address pretty much the whole range of things that you might see on a URAC or that you might encounter in this counseling. And it gives you just some different phone numbers, web resources, other ways that you can get in touch with some things to help out the soldier if they're having problems in one of those areas. On the right-hand side, some basic responsibilities. It's really encouraging a robust discussion is essentially what that is, and taking appropriate action if you do notice that there are concerns. This is not something that gets filed away in a drawer. If you know that somebody's having trouble, it doesn't just get put away in a drawer and forgotten about until the next month when you do it again. This is a monthly thing, but in between those monthly counselings, you should be following up with that person if they've been having some problems and seeing how they're going forward with addressing those. Soldiers are responsible for completing it with the supervisor. They choose what they discuss as far as difficulties, and then submitting a plan of action. There are some risk factors that have been identified. And then in the end, 3 soldiers and supervisor are responsible for working together and ensuring that this occurs each month. They do work pretty independently for the most part, but every week they check in with their supervisor anyway, and at least once a week, but it really should be pretty much every day. Almost every day they're going to check in either at the beginning or end of the day, even though they might go out and do their recruiting operations, you know, we'd give a presentation somewhere, do whatever they do, but they come back to the recruiting station at that time. They should check in with their supervisor, and that's an opportunity not just for them about recruiting stuff that happened, but you know, emotional situations and whatnot. But every single person in that recruiting station should be seen by and talked to their supervisor at least once a week, and in cases almost. So yeah, that's a good question. Okay, so this is some of the scoring that goes into the assessment. Supervisor asks some of these general questions before starting the URAC. How do you feel you're performing at work? What are your top professional goals? With respect to these, what obstacles do you face? And how do you describe your home life? Those are more general, but you'd be surprised some of the details that people will give that'll lead you into more specifics just on those 4 general questions. I've had a lot of really sort of unexpected conversations, I guess, where, you know, if I hadn't asked those questions, we wouldn't have gone into that whole conversation. And it's just stuff you don't normally think about asking people to describe their home life to you on a daily basis, but when you do, sometimes you get some surprising answers. And then it gets into more specifics here, like for family, have you gone through a breakup, divorce, kids' difficulties, child care issues? A geographical bachelor for the military is somebody who's separated geographically from their spouse. And the supportiveness of their family environment. And this is an overall summary of the different risk factors. So again, that looks like it's a little bit out of because you're going from specific family stuff to the overall risk scoring. But just think of this as one of the last pages because it's the overall summary of the different scores. And it gives different color codes, which are kind of explanatory, I suppose. If you see overall functioning well, still functioning, or may appear functioning, but most likely struggling. And then red, serious stuff going on. Will become combat ineffective, which basically means probably socially ineffective for their family and everything else as well. And seek help immediately. Again, areas of concern on the left, looking at different risk factors in the total scores. The more specific stuff over here on the right is spiritual and social support network. I won't read each of those, but essentially relationships with other people. Life, are you satisfied with your job? Do you feel like you're valued on your job? Different, more specific things like have you been deployed? Do you feel like you're supported by your unit? Physical health, do you have any medical issues, any appointments that we can help make sure you get taken care of? That's something that's kind of big in recruiting is help scheduling medical appointments because we have such a sort of a rapid schedule all the time with other stuff going on that it's maybe hard for people to get to their medical appointments if the supervisor isn't actively engaged in saying, okay, take this period of time. If that's when your appointment is, we'll have somebody else cover for you. You go take care of that, come back and we'll get the job done. Prescriptions, do you exercise regularly for the military? That should be everybody saying yes, but we know that when things get stressful, sometimes that's one of the first things to go is the exercise schedule. I'm just as guilty of that as the next person as far as you got a lot of things on the plate. Sometimes the exercise gets put by the wayside. So, but we try to make sure that doesn't, that we're tracking that if somebody's having a hard time with that. Okay, substance abuse. I'm sure you have talk about how often substance abuse comes right along with all the stress and anxiety that we experience, whether it's military or civilian. So we ask a lot of questions with regard to substance abuse, everything from their patterns of drinking, whether it's just occasional social drinks, the amount that they drink, when they drink, what time of day, all of those kinds of things. Personal behaviors, things like have you with the law, driving too fast, risky behavior. If your PPE is personal protective equipment, if they're driving a motorcycle or an ATV, they have to have that. It's a requirement in the military, and they have to use it. Frustration and anger problems, financial difficulties, maybe not surprised, but there's a lot of financial difficulties that are happening, and recruiters are probably more susceptible to that than other military folks because, again, they don't have that support network that you would have on a military installation, and it can be very costly in the civilian world. If, you from, let's say, Fort Knox, which is in Kentucky, in semi-rural Kentucky, if you come from there and you move to the Chicago area, like we've had people do, all of a sudden your cost of living has gone through the roof, probably triple what it would be in Kentucky. Yes, the military compensates a little bit and gives you a higher allowance for housing and that kind of thing. But if you're an E5 sergeant coming out of Kentucky and come into the Chicago area, you might not always be fully aware of all of the additional costs that go into living here, and might, put yourself in a housing situation that's more than you can afford, and things start spiraling downward with financial issues. So we try to advise people before they come out on recruiting duty, to budget effectively. We do have some resources available to those who've had a hard time with that, and help them with their financial planning. Stress symptoms, some of the things that all of these other stress and risk factors that people might encounter, these are the symptoms that might point to those things that you probably have talked about and will continue to talk about in here. Little interest in doing things that used to be pleasurable, feeling down, depressed, trouble falling asleep. We see sleep pattern problems all the time, both military and civilian, whenever there's a lot of stress going on. Wound up or restless, trouble concentrating on things that shouldn't be hard to concentrate on, like TV, books, so on. And whether you've had any thoughts of hurting yourself or anyone else, either past or currently. And as far as some of these go over here, and actually some of probably the substance abuse as well, you can imagine that some of those have a stigma attached to them, right? So it's kind of hard to get people to admit to some of those sometimes, which is why this should be a conversation that's oriented towards making sure that that person, the subordinate, if you're the leader and you're having this conversation, that the subordinate knows you're there to help them. You're not there to punish them. You're not there to support them. You're not, and none of those things. You're there to help that person if they need a little extra help, and to let them know it's okay that everybody needs a little extra help. Sometimes you got to have support of your family and your unit and everything. So it's not always easy to get that through to somebody, but you do the best you can, and you hope that they'll be honest with you about it. Usually, if it's relatively informal, they are.
Captain Racco, can you address the difference between substance abuse using alcohol and substance abuse using street drugs in the military?
Yeah.
It's very different than in the civilian world.
Right, that's a good point. Yeah, it's a huge difference, because in the military, the street drugs are grounds for having somebody kicked out of the Army, or have a Uniform Code of Military Justice charges brought against them, and that kind of thing. Whereas alcohol, obviously it's legal, so people may abuse it, but the programs in place are more how do I say, there's not much of a punitive side, I guess I would say, on the alcohol things. So people are more likely to probably reach out for help than they would be if they were using illegal drugs or street drugs.
There's substance abuse programs that are meant to help with alcohol abuse.
Right.
And it's not an offense that you will get discharged.
Yeah, but it's less punitive, so right, they're more likely to reach out for help with something like that, to admit that they have a coke problem, or whatever it might be, that would carry a penalty with it in the military. But even so, we try to encourage people that the right thing to do is to get help, and the penalties for such things are going to be a lot less if they reach out for help than they would be if they're found out through a drug test, or they come up hot on a periodic drug test. Yep. Question.
When it comes to the drugs part of it, or the substance part of it, if they're deployed and they're out of the country, would our laws still apply, even though they're in the military in a different country?
Yeah, they fall under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, so it's the term uniform, it implies it's the same for everybody in the military, and so that's the system of laws that they fall under, regardless of what the country is. They still have to abide by the laws of whatever country they're in, but what's more sort of overarching, I guess, is the Uniform Code of Military Justice, no matter where they are. And so, in that case, drugs would be an example of that. Even if they're in a country, I don't know, let's say they go to Amsterdam or something, and they can legally do some of those drugs, they still can't do it because they fall under the Uniform Code of Military Justice that says no, you can't. So whichever is more strict, I guess, would be what they would want to adhere to. Okay, good question on that one. Okay, let's see what else we have. And this is just more resources on this. This goes along with that other resource page that we saw. This is a series of different phone numbers, whereas the other one had both phone numbers and addresses. Okay. Any questions on the URAC survey? Yeah. Uh-huh.
So is this available for, use, say if as a clinician I was working with a veteran, would something like this be available for a civilian to use, to support them, and also this program, the fitness program, is that also available? It would seem that if a veteran had used this in their military life, that it might be a comfortable or familiar tool that then could support them on moving through some difficulties.
Yeah,
in
I'm trying to.
civilian life.
That's a good point. I'm trying to think. I think it is available through Army Knowledge Online if there's like a retired military person, or if they still have their if they still have that account, which somebody who's retired would still have, or has any kind of affiliation with the military would still have. I think they could access it. I'd have to double check on that. That's a good question. But as far as this goes, it's not copyright anything. So if you wanted to take pieces of it and use it for your own purposes, there's nothing that would prevent you from doing it, because it's a pretty good overall discussion tool.
So how long ago did the combat fitness training, this program, start? How long has it been?
It's been I probably want to say like 5 years or something like that. From what did they call it before? It was comprehensive soldier fitness is only probably 3 years or something like that. But before that, it was I'm trying to think of what it used to be. Battlemind. Yeah. So probably 5 years for Battlemind, give or take a year or two, and then it melded into comprehensive soldier fitness. And Battlemind used to include some biofeedback elements and some other stuff that didn't make it into the comprehensive soldier fitness, maybe just because the evidence wasn't as strong. It's harder to implement. Some people don't trust in it as much. But this has a lot more psychoeducation training components to it than Battlemind did. So it sort of morphed into this.
So I think it would be good for us to just have an idea of how long it's been in use, because if we're working with a veteran that's just out, they probably have had experience with this, and we can use it as a resource tool for them to recall.
If they've been in during the current wars, unless they were just out at the beginning of them, might not know about it. But those who had been in, I don't know, a few years down the road of Iraq and Afghanistan, they'd probably be familiar with it, and you could sort of use those terms, and they would know, especially if it's been in the last years that they've gotten out. Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, I think we talked about the first part there, that they live the skills, and then the counseling. That's what led us to the URAC, to talk a little bit more about the counseling. And teaches the skills with periodic courses and deployment modules based on rotation schedules. And this is where I talked about how if they're deploying, they're going to go through this process more often than somebody who's not deploying, for instance. And the trade-out courses, again, is every time they go through career training on the way. Serves as commander's advisor regarding total fitness and resilience training issues. So my comprehensive soldier fitness trainer in my company happens to be a company trainer. So that person's responsible for all the training in the company, but they have specialized training skills in comprehensive soldier fitness. And so they advise me when they see that there's a problem. Often it's two-way conversation, me and the trainer talking about it together. Hey, we had this problem over here. The individual, for instance, who had a physical confrontation, alleged physical confrontation with his spouse, that kind of a situation. Okay, well, what happened there? What can we do to make sure that this doesn't happen again as best we can? I mean, we can't control people 24 hours a day, but at least if we can recognize the warning signs and prepare somebody to deal with arguments with their spouse a little more effectively, then maybe we can help prevent something like that. And to refer soldiers for professional counseling to behavioral health providers or appropriate resources. And so they should advise me as the commander, especially if I'm a brand new commander and haven't had that much experience commanding troops, my comprehensive soldier fitness trainer should be the person who advises me, hey, I think Joe Snuffy over here is having a problem that's gone on what I'm capable of helping him with. I think we need to refer. And so then we'd all have that conversation and, make sure that we get that person the appropriate help. Okay, so a little bit about whether this works, and does it matter? I don't probably be talking about it if I didn't, if it didn't work, but I'm going to show you how we know that it works. Okay, so this was a Navy resilience study that was done, and this led us to where we are today and sort of helped us evaluate whether this stuff did work. This was in 2004. Took a bunch of recruits and did some assessments on them, some actual clinical assessments, and looked at where they were in terms of different possible psychological problems that they may be having or be prone to having. Took the upper 75% and separated them from the lower 25%, which means upper being those who are less likely to have those issues and lower being those who are more likely to have those issues. Obviously, if they were having severe issues at the time, they would get treatment and they would probably fall out of this group. But in this case, we're looking at who are more prone to those types of issues. Everybody in the upper 75% went through the normal training, normal basic training that all Navy folks go through. Half of the lower 25% went through the normal training that everybody goes through. And then this other group of the lower 25% went through an additional 45 minutes per week group resilience training. So they had that additional component that none of these other people had. And so the question is, where did the results come out? Okay, so taking a look at how many recruits or what percentage of recruits were separated for psychological reasons, pretty small percentages overall, but it's enough to tell that there was a significant difference between the groups. Of the upper 75%, there were only 1% that fell out from psychological reasons. Of the lower 25% in the control group, the ones who just had the regular training and nothing more, because they were more prone to having psychological issues, you had 7% of them who fell out of basic training for psychological reasons. They didn't have any additional training, and they were already predisposed towards having those kinds of issues. Of the lower 25% that had the resiliency training, there were only 1% who fell out of the training because of psychological reasons. So huge difference there between 1% and 7%. So essentially, even though these folks were much more prone to having psychological problems than the upper 75%, their rate of falling out was about the same because they had that resilience training. You look over here, completion of training is sort of the reverse of that side. We're looking at the completion rates, how many of them, total percentage that completed. Upper 75%, 80 some odd percent. Lower 25% that had the resiliency training, it's actually a hair higher than those who were in the upper 75%. So even though they were predisposed to be more likely to have those kinds of problems, thanks to the training that they went through, they were slightly less likely, I don't know whether that's a significant difference or not, but slightly less likely to have problems completing their training, slightly more likely to complete. And then obviously here the lower 25% control group were less likely, significantly less likely to complete the training. It works is what this all means. Okay, so a U.S. military cohort study looking at 5,410 soldiers with no prior history of PTSD. Those folks deploy. No PTSD after deployment were 92.7%, and those who had a PTSD diagnosis after deployment, 7.3% of that total group. Looking at the next slide. Again, that total group, psychological evaluations pre-deployment, separating out the upper 85%, meaning those less likely to have psychological issues from the lower 15%. Post-deployment, Of the upper 85%, 96.4 had no PTSD, and 3.6 had a new case of PTSD that was diagnosed. Of the lower 15%, 71.8% had no PTSD, and this one is sort of highlighted here because that's a huge number when you look at the lower 15%, those who are more predisposed towards having issues with resilience. 28% of them in this group had new PTSD. So the likelihood of that occurring in that group, it's almost a third of that group. So you know that that's your target population, the one that's most likely to have issues. And if we can decrease this number and increase this number of the lower 15% by doing some resilience training, you have an opportunity to make a huge impact on that group. And this is looking at specifically the Comprehensive Soldier Fitness Training Fitness Tracker, Soldier Fitness Tracker, the GAT survey, and their emotional fitness scores as compared with PTSD screenings. And so you look at the emotional fitness score, 5 being the highest, the best emotional fitness, you have nobody in that column who was identified having PTSD on a PTSD screening. Whereas the 1 being the lowest emotional fitness GAT survey, you have a pretty significant, huge percentage that were identified as PTSD. 40% of that group identified as PTSD. So what this is showing us is that the Soldier Fitness Tracker matches up with people's propensity to have PTSD following a traumatic event under deployment. So again, that just shows that the survey actually works.
When it comes to some of these numbers, does, let's say that one is more likely, this one, less likely, but do they actually serve in the same place? I mean, this guy a cook and that guy's a Marine or something on the line? I mean, wouldn't the number be different based on their job title?
It would be, yeah. But this is looking on a broader scale, just looking at everybody as a whole group, as opposed to, if you were looking at infantrymen or medics, for instance, those folks who are going to see combat, they're going to see death, destruction, blood, the really nasty stuff, they're going to be more likely to have PTSD, but the scale will still look similar to this. The numbers might not be exactly the same. It'll look similar to this where those who went in with a GAT survey score of 5 that have strong emotional fitness are most likely to come out of that without PTSD. Maybe not 100%, but maybe 90-something%, it's going to be a pretty good chance of coming out with PTSD. Whereas the 1%, in this scenario, if it's, let's say, infantrymen who saw a lot of action, a lot of IEDs or something like that, where people got blown up by explosive devices, okay, so maybe instead of 40% of them having PTSD, be a full 50%, half and half or something. But it's going to be a comparable distribution where those who have 5s are going to be pretty well off, and those who have 1s are not going to be as well off. Post-deployment health reassessment. So that's looking at their health coming out of a combat scenario and sort of where they're at with regard to their health, and it takes into account psychological health as well as physical health.
After 9/11, the Office of the Secretary of Defense for Health Affairs really wanted to do a screening for emotional issues as well as physical issues for all deploying service members. So there was a pre-deployment health assessment, and then when people came back from combat, they did a post-deployment health reassessment, and then people then are tracked 6 months later and 12 months later, so that we've got some data points. And so the scale here shows a percentage of service members with the GAT and the post-deployment health reassessment scores to take a look at which symptoms they're identifying with regard to depression, anxiety, PTSD, other kinds of issues.
Good question. Yeah, we sometimes have all these acronyms on here and sometimes forget to say what each of them means. But, and then finally, just a quote from our former Secretary of Defense. The Army has accelerated its ability to adapt to rapidly changing circumstances. This is a key advantage, not just in counterinsurgency, but in any type of conflict. where the 75% solution fielded in months, often better than a 99% solution that might take years. So make of that what you will, that quote, but it's very rarely going to be a 100% solution or even a 99% solution. We've seen this, these tools that we're using right now really start to take effect. It took years to happen overnight, and it takes tweaking along the way. It's a fluid, changing system of training and assessment, and all of the components that go into it are constantly changing. But we've seen it start to take effect. This last year was the first, we just got the data back recently, this last year was the first year in a while that we've seen suicide rates actually decrease in the Army. We're going up, 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 and this year they went down. So that's a very good thing for us to continue that trend back downward. It helps that we're only in one theater of operations right now for the most part. But I don't, by any means, it's just that, because I think it's a lot of the tools we put in place. And there's additional training that we do that's not even incorporated in comprehensive soldier fitness specific. So there's a lot of other things that we continue to do as well, which if anybody has questions about those at some point, I'd be happy to answer those. But what questions do you have about comprehensive soldier fitness or the GAT or the URAC or any of the stuff we just talked about? Mm-hmm.
So when you have a NCO that's a trainer, is that their job, or is that a secondary?
Yeah, it's an additional duty that they would have in addition to their regular job is. So their regular job could be, I don't know, platoon sergeant or something, or it could be, in the case of they're the company trainer, but they'll have what their main job is, and ideally we would choose someone who's an expert in their field, who's good at whatever their job is, because you want them to be respected and the go-to person for other soldiers in their unit. So you somebody who's good at their job, who is for whatever their role is, and put somebody like that in that kind of a additional role.
So you've been in the service for a while, and you were obviously in before the comprehensive soldier fitness was in place. Do you see a difference?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, there's been a huge difference in the way we look at mental health in the military. Like I mentioned, there's not a 100% solution yet. There's still issues with stigma and people not wanting to report because they're afraid of getting put out of their unit or separated from their unit or looked at differently as somebody who would not be able to perform on the job or whatever. There's still stigma. If you were to look at a trend, like a stigma trend, I don't know, do a survey or something, you would see a dramatic drop-off over the last several years in how that type of thing is perceived. It helps that we've had some really, really top-level leaders, generals, and the like, who've come out and said, hey, I came back from deployment, I lost a bunch of soldiers, and I had some really tough stuff I had to deal with, and I went and got help for it, and I'm a better person for it. When a general says something like that, they're not afraid to talk about it. In fact, they're looking for opportunities to talk about it. That tells a lot of soldiers on down the line that is okay. That you should be able to do that because it makes you a more effective member of your team. And so from having generals to the colonels to company commanders like myself, talking about it as something that's not only acceptable but encouraged, because it makes you more capable, not less, to get help with stuff like that, had a tremendous impact, and we've seen a vast improvement.
One of the problems is that there's been a number of programs that have been out there, and the last count that I've heard is there's something like 900 programs that are available for military members and their families, but only a half a dozen have had solid research done and that are evidence-based, and this is one of the programs. Mm-hmm. So we're going to be talking about some of the others as we go on in the class, but as Captain Rakow showed you, there's been some pretty solid research, some recent research in 2009 that shows that this program has actually had an effect, a very positive effect on our military members. And I think, again, to follow up on your comment about stigma, I think when you have general officers, national leaders talk about the fact that they had mental health issues and they sought help, and it made a huge difference in their life, just like the movie that we saw here in the first class. It sends a very powerful message to the soldiers, the airmen, the Marines. So I think our culture is changing, and it's taken a long time, but I'm certainly seeing the effects of it, and so is the Army.
Absolutely.
Other observations, comments, questions, reflections? Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Captain Rackow. I greatly appreciate it.